and we are going to talk all things sustainability. So on our panel, we have Dr. Sheila Nguyen, we have Dr. Kimberly Camras and Flynn Pearman. So Dr. Sheila Nguyen is a leading regenerative built environment design professional who consults globally on strategic and operational environmental sustainability issues. Sheila is recognised by the Australian Financial Review as a top 100 women of influence for her leadership in galvanising the sport industry to protect and respect the natural environment. Is the co-founder of non-executive director of the Sport Environment Alliance and is currently the head of the sustainability for this year's FIFA Women's World Cup. Round of applause. Yeah.
Buy a ticket. Come on, Mabel.
I have bought lots of tickets. I'm so excited.
I love it.
We have Dr. Kimberly Camras. She's a sustainability professional with extensive experience in driving positive environmental and social outcomes, including in her current role as the Queensland's Government Director of Climate Positive Brisbane 2032 and Climate Futures. Kimberly leads a team of delivering the government's response to our climate positive and sustainability commitments made for the Brisbane 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games and implementing a range of policies, programs and partnerships to drive Queensland's transition to a net zero climate resilient economy. Pretty cool. And Flynn Pearman will this year complete dual degrees in engineering and mathematics at University of Queensland. He is a Vice Chancellor Scholar and Scholar of the Andrew N. Livers Academy for Innovation and Leadership at UQ. Flynn combines his ongoing involvement in community sport with his passion for sustainability and his interest in leveraging the power of sport to create positive and sustainable impacts. Whoa. Pretty impressed. Can we get a round of applause for these guys? Now, we heard this morning the Deputy Mayor discussing Brisbane 2032 is going to be a carbon neutral Games. Carbon positive. Would you like to start the discussion on, how is this going to happen? I think it's pretty ambitious. So how's it going to happen?
Well, I'm sure Kimberly will have more to say about what Brisbane's doing. And I love the theme. Tim did a good job in thinking about, next. And this is really, for us, the tournament is now. So I think, for us, it's really great in the room just to listen to how people are thinking about the future, because oftentimes what we have to do first is all those inputs. Like, what are we going to do now to make sure that that vision that you have for 2032 and afterwards looks the way that you want it to look? So I guess for the Olympic Games, and you can speak to that, but from our perspective, what our role is in the tournament and in the runway, because we talk about the green and gold runway, and the tournament being the first kickoff, first pun intended here, event for the green and gold runway. And we really, as an organization and then within our team and sustainability, and I'll just let you know that we have, when we think about sustainability at the tournament, we're thinking about it very holistically. So, I usually use this saying, happy people and healthy planet equals football love forever. And that's kind of how we encapsulate sustainability. But, the way we think about it, it's not just environmental sustainability, which is what, Kimberly, you're working in, but it includes safeguarding, accessibility, human rights, as well as climate. And we even have Katie Hodges, who's our safeguarding officer manager in the room. She's right there. Wave to everyone. And it's really fantastic because, of course, this idea of sustainability is an interconnection. And but yeah, to answer your question, how are we going to do it? I think the first thing to do, and this is something that we've experienced just being in this position, to think about how do we define sustainability and how that will then lead into, because the IOC as well expects a kind of holistic approach to sustainability where all of these things feed in. You heard it all day long. You've heard everyone talk about systems. They talked about ecosystem, the volunteers in your system, and infrastructure, and how do you create the right kinds of mechanisms to make sure everyone feels safe and welcoming. That's kind of the mentality. We think about the system, and we're thinking about how do we improve that system and all of those levers, accessibility, climate, human rights, and sustainability, so that it feeds into a more climate positive or a healthy positive, community in the future. But there's like so many other things I want to say, but that's probably the focus point.
No, that's fine. Leading on that, what does sports need to do to wrap their head around that sustainability conversation? So what are some tangible things that sports can do? And whoever wants to.
I might jump in there. Just adding to what Sheila was saying about the Climate Positive Brisbane Games quickly first, if I may. I think there's 3 pillars of positivity that the IOC has set for games such as Brisbane to meet. And the first is reducing emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. So basically reducing emissions as much as possible in any way possible, through avoiding them, through going renewable, and only using offsets as a really last resort. The second is offsetting more than 100% of the renewable emissions that we can't avoid from the games. And both of those things are kind of more event-centred. They're around the Olympic and Paralympic Games as events, and some of the preparatory activities that will need to be undertaken to deliver those events. But the third pillar of climate positivity is the most nebulous, but I think the most exciting, and that's around using the Olympic and Paralympic movement as a catalyst to drive climate action and long-lasting sustainability change. So that can mean a lot of things, and it means different things for different host regions, obviously. So we're in the process at the moment of defining what that actually looks like collectively for Queensland. And as Sheila also mentioned, we've actually, as host partners for the Olympic and Paralympic Games, made commitments against 5 sustainability priority areas, from climate to mobility to workforce and infrastructure and natural sites. So it's really exciting to think about how we leverage that. In terms of sports more broadly, I think there's a couple of things. There's action at a global level, or a collective level as a sporting, global community. And we're seeing that through some of the work Sheila and others have done on sports for climate and sports for nature as international frameworks and collectives where sporting bodies are signing on to be part of collective action to, meet our responsibilities as sporting entities around climate action and around biodiversity. And what's exciting about that is we've heard a lot about data today, and once we have people a part of a collective action, we can actually measure the impact of all of those individual pieces of action collectively, and really get a picture about what the global sporting community is doing to reduce emissions and to increase other sustainability outcomes. We're seeing similar movements, I guess, at an Australian level with collectives of athletes and campaigns such as the Cool Down, really bringing athletes together and helping sporting clubs and bodies take the early steps around reducing their own impacts. And another kind of trite but true saying in the sustainability world is you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think the first step is for people to get an understanding, and for sporting bodies, for clubs, to get an understanding of what that impact is, but then understand that the drivers for change are not just environmental or sustainable, they're actually economic. It makes economic sense now to do that.
If I can just add on to what Sheila and Kimberly are saying. From my perspective, I'm not directly involved in the sports industry. I study engineering, so I like, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about what we learn about sustainability and design from engineering. And a key part of the engineering design process is having your requirements and then coming up with a solution that fits those requirements. So it's great hearing about the strategic objective of climate positivity, carbon neutral, for these big events like the 2032 Olympics. But how does that also filter down to a local level? And that comes through, if we can have sustainability as a key objective at a local level, that will filter through the decision-making process. So anytime we're coming up with a solution or an activity or creating anything sports related, if sustainability across its aspects of social and environmental is there as part of the decision-making process, that will come out in the outcome. I think also in engineering, you guys were talking about the holistic nature of sustainability. This was in first year. You're looking at sustainability from three key aspects: social, environmental, and financial. Those are the pillars of sustainable development. And I think sport does a really good job and has a focus on the social aspect of that with all the participation, community health and all that. I think that's already a key strategic objective there at a local level and at a high level. Financially is always important. That's not going to change, but I think what Kimberly was saying about leveraging the power of sport to uplift that environmental aspect, not just in sport, but more broadly, is super important.
Yeah, so true. Sheila, we've got, our changes in our sport and recreation, and we're seeing heaps of focus put on sustainability. But how can our sport and rec industry at scale play part in achieving these emission reductions and net zero targets?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a huge opportunity, and you in the room, you're working with these communities, and they're responsible for being the stewards of clubs, but they're also looking after, we keep talking about ecosystems, all the people inputs, but as well the infrastructure inputs, and I think that's a huge opportunity. I know Kieran earlier talked about, infrastructure, that's a thing, but it is actually the thing, because when you create, and I heard this earlier from, the accessibility conversations, the women conversations, it needs to be safe, it needs to be welcoming, it needs to be fit for purpose, that, this is a place where everyone can participate and be inclusive in that respect. And at the same time, considering its impact on the natural world and the environment, on emissions, for example. But it's a huge opportunity. So one of the things the tournament is doing, which is really incredible, and it'll come out more in the public communications domain soon. But there are requirements that FIFA has on the tournament and of the 2 host countries. If you can imagine, this is a huge event. I know we talked about it earlier, but 9 host cities, 2 countries, 10 venues. I mean, it's not small. And on top of it, you have all these base camps and places where the teams are actually going to reside and use as their home. And in every piece of that infrastructure, there is a set of expectations on how those spaces and places operate, not just physically, but also from an operational perspective. So some interventions, and I call it infrastructure intervention, because of the fact that in those spaces, there are things like basic stuff like a toilet for women, or like closed private stalls, all gender toilets, et cetera, so, and then accessible ramps, et cetera. I mean, there's universal design we've been talking about before, but it's this piece around how do we look at the infrastructure, and think something that I often reference is how do us in sport, including the infrastructure that we're looking after, how are we in the world? What do we want to actually be in the world? And what does that mean in terms of contributing positively to the world? So that includes things like having a very light footprint. And so the infrastructure for our 10 stadia are all undergoing green building certification. And if that doesn't sound really boring, it does when I say it out loud, but it's like the most exciting part of this, to be honest, because Flynn talked about uplift, by the fact that these 10 major stadia, as one of the first, it is the first tournament of this green and gold runway, is going to be green. They're all going to be green building certified. Now it's not just, oh, hey, you're a great venue, you can host Ed Sheeran. It is actually now sustainably performing. And because of that, it upgrades all of our expectations of what infrastructure should do in the world. And just as a point of context, before this intervention, there were only 2 stadia that actually had that certification. And so I think this is going to be huge from like a signaling perspective. But infrastructure is a huge part of this idea of how are we going to participate actively in the emissions reduction. So going back to the community, what does that mean? It's not just the certification, but also the people in and around those spaces. How do they interact with that space? They're going to have to upskill their, capability and their understanding. And I think all of you in the room, being in your leadership positions, have the opportunity to set that tone from the top of what is a priority of your infrastructure, and then the people who operate in and around it.
Yeah, absolutely. So then how do we know that we're on the right path? Like how do sports and industry know that they're doing, their bit to become more sustainable? Like
Yeah, it's a great question. I think from a certification and ratings perspective, Sheila makes a really great point that some of those venues, potentially have been able to make unverified claims previously about the level of their sustainability, and by ensuring that all of those venues are being rated according to an accredited globally leading third-party certifier, that's really critical in the first instance. But in terms of sporting organisations at all levels, I think the other key, there are a few key elements. I think knowing your footprint and knowing your emissions contribution. It sounds really technical and complicated. It's not, and there are resources for all levels of sporting organisations out there through, even through campaigns such as the Cool Down. So knowing that first, and then getting assistance to identify what are often quite easy low-cost interventions to become more efficient operationally and therefore reduce energy costs as well. Also being aware of what's out there from a funding perspective particularly across the Queensland government with regards to funding and grants for solar PV on sporting clubs is really important. So I guess starting that kind of journey of measure, manage, mitigate, and then improve can be applied at all levels. From a major event context, I think the other really key intervention that we can make and that we're trying to make through Brisbane 2032 is with regards to procurement, something that also sounds a bit dull, but is actually, in my opinion, one of the main ways that we're actually going to drive change. So the Queensland Government, for example, and at the Council host partners, the OCOG, we're really working to establish what are the responsible sourcing principles that will be in place that you have to meet if you're going to be able to be involved in procurement for the Games. And it's about setting those as really ambitious standards across all aspects of sustainability, and embedding that in policy, and then eventually moving that beyond just a Games focus to something as just how we do business in Queensland with all of the money we spend. So I think that's really exciting as a transformative lever, but the money side of things is not just limited to government. Where we all as individuals or clubs put our money matters as well, in terms of the banks that we use, the insurances and schemes that we purchase, the superannuation schemes that we pay into. They actually are really big opportunities for us all to make different decisions about what's been done with our money. So I think it's about that breadth of change that's, yes, definitely happening at a global and mega event level, but increasingly there's options for that change to happen at a local level as well. And quite frankly, I think, and you'll be able to speak better to this, but demand particularly from young people, but all areas of society, that action actually takes place.
Yeah, so I think from a young person perspective, I see sport as it's such an important part of so many people's lives and has a great connection with, like, on a personal level, and clubs are part of your identity, your sport that you play is part of your identity, and leveraging that to have positive environmental sustainability effects is super crucial. To continue on talking about like what sort of signals we can look for that we're on the right track, I think like these, sometimes slightly boring things like procurement and green building design, infrastructure, all these technologies that make an event and make our facilities sustainable are super important. But a signal that we're on the right track is that at all levels of the sport industry, we're thinking holistically. And so an example I can point to, in the States, there's a golf tournament called the Waste Management Phoenix Open, and it's one of the most sustainable sort of sporting events, and they publicise it a lot about their sustainability efforts with regards to no waste going to landfill and renewable energy and all that stuff. But what they found is that their biggest source of carbon emissions, by a factor of 20, is the fan transportation of people going to and from the event. So that's not just the event. These emissions are coming because of the event, but it's not something that they can control. So thinking at that level, and then also thinking at the level of influencing behaviours beyond sport, because the behavioural change is such a hard part of change management, and I think sports connection to the identity and using that is a really good way to go about broader change, because as we've heard, as sport continues to grow in terms of women's involvement and accessibility, inclusivity, the types of people that sport can reach is only going to get bigger.
If I could just add really briefly to that, the same applies in terms of the emissions contribution of spectator travel for the Games. So in all of the estimated footprinting work that we've done so far, by far and away the likely largest volume of carbon emissions will be generated by people flying here largely from overseas. And you don't want to disincentivise Southern Hemisphere regions from hosting games and getting the benefits out of those either, nor do we want to miss out on the economic benefits that will come from that influx of people to our regions. So I think it's really interesting that you bring that up, because I think that what that means is there's an onus on governments to really invest and partner with the research sector around how can we look for alternative technologies, innovative approaches to solving the wicked problems of aviation emissions and things like that as well. So I think that's a really important point. It's our sphere of influence and what we consider has to be a lot broader.
Yeah. And where do we find this information? Like, I'm sure sports want to become, really sustainable, but we have so much information out there. How do we find it? How do we make it simple and easy for sports?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone in the room wants to do the right thing, and there's a lot of jargon. There's a lot of technical things that some of us are talking about. That's big and overwhelming. But having worked at the Sports Environment Alliance, we worked on a set of resources in a state that the deputy mayor said is 50 years behind. So in Victoria, obviously I'm back in the future by being in Brisbane. But in terms of resources, we've got with the Victorian government a resource for really targeting community clubs on how do they even start their journey with checklists and things like that. The ACT released a hockey stick report. South Australia also released a report many years ago. I think it's called Star Clubs. So at that level, there's a lot of resources, and I mean, it's simple things that people can do, and as volunteers, as community people, just making better decisions at that level. But if you're talking about from a governance perspective, and the Corporations Act does say that this is, environment as being one of those key governance risk areas. I know I'm sure some of your boards are already thinking about it. If they're not, this is definitely a priority area. You already see that, happening across the board. With cricket, having with the air quality issues when we had bushfire, we had Queensland floods, we've had drought in Victoria, the millennium drought. This is a real issue that's affecting our communities and communities in sport. What are we doing to protect? And I like using this because it's easy to remember, but protect the people who are playing sport, because there's children and elderly who are exposed to extreme heat, etc. You've got the places, it's your assets. These are the ones that need to have longevity. Is it resilient when it comes to extreme conditions? And then it's the priorities, the policies. From a governance perspective, do we care about this enough to put some money behind it, to invest into, from a procurement point of view and an ecosystem point of view? And I'll just take one more example from Victoria again. But for a long time now, they've invested in identifying any grants that are released for community clubs. They need to, if it's for infrastructure, 25% of it has to go into ESD, so environmentally sustainable design. And I think that's a good mechanism, just a way to incentivize people and organizations to get around new thinking and forward thinking. And everyone's been talking about it today, like innovation, sports tech, yeah, all right, if that's cool, we're getting around it. Let's put our investment behind clean tech and then integrate that into what we're already doing and what we're doing well. I mean, I'll just harp back on for you guys to think about, but the procurement piece is really interesting, actually. This is something we take very seriously at the tournament, and we understand we're a blip in the time of history in the sporting landscape, but when we use this time, how are we investing that time and how are we investing that money? All our RFPs, we are assessing our tenders based off of a number of criteria across the social and environmental landscape. So it's things like, is this a women-led business? Is this a Maori business? Is this a First Nations business? Even, for example, from a safeguarding perspective, we have women teams coming in. Security, when we're doing their RFPs, they want to have a company, a service provider, who's going to give them 50% at least that their security force are women. Because when something happens in the hotel room, sometimes women want to feel, safer when there's a woman coming in as opposed to a man. So these are small things but important things that we take into consideration when we're assessing the money that's spent, where it's being spent, so that we uplift and invest in that capability. And I'll say one more thing, is that, the numbers that were thrown around earlier about 75,000 volunteers or whatever the numbers were, 3 million, this, that, it's funny because we call, obviously people say there are more sheep than people in New Zealand, right? And we have tournaments there. So everybody and their mother is being employed by the tournament right now in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I hope no one's offended by that. But, but we need to upskill and really invest in the capability that's in our volunteers, that are in the people that we have, the smarts that we have in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. I can say that I have an Aussie passport, okay, so I'm like you, but I have an American accent. But the thing is, for example, one of the key things that we were really focused on for just in our team, sustainability. All of us are female and identify as female. We've got a sustainability venue manager at every venue who's going to be our point person. Our big focus was Kiwis and Aussies. That was the focus. We had tons of CVs coming from UK, Canada, all very, very clever, very capable people. But we said no, we're going to invest in Kiwis and Aussies. It's like a Jenga game, you guys, because every person who said no, I'm like moving it around. It's a pain. Let's just say it's being recorded, but it's a pain. But let's say this is a commitment we're making, and if we get all of them accept their offer, it also will be all of them are women. So that's the other thing, we've just got to keep on investing we talked about ideals, how do we make the ideals of today's ideals and standards, rather than waiting for it to happen, eventually, organically.
Yeah.